of lectures for this season. But Michael told me that my very first assignment tonight is I have to apologize for the lack of signage. And promise you that you'll have signage and signs that you're going to come. And as usual, Dennis has put my advertising material together. So I want to assure all of you that we will be continuing with 3 more lectures. Each one starting Wednesday at 7 o'clock. And coming up next week, Steffi Corey will make a presentation on historic Fall River Fire. As you probably know, Steffi has recently written a book on the subject. The following week, Dr. Philip Sylvia will continue the baseball series with a talk on the New England League Indians and the Fall River State. Each time will be Wednesday starting at 7 o'clock. We'd also like to thank the Grimshaw Goodwin Charitable Foundation for making all of these events available free to the public. We also have some other free events this summer. On July 23rd and 24th, the Striving Artists Theater Company will present Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors in the Historical Society Gallery. This is the 4th time we've had the pleasure of hosting this group, and the attendance has been growing every year. And beginning Saturday, August 13th, we start our 4th annual Saturday Evening Serenades, kicking off with the Nightlight Orchestra, a 13-piece big band, and a huge favorite every time. Also, I'm asked to remind everyone that we're always looking for members. I'm sure everybody here is a member. If you have some friends, if you have family, do what you can to get them to enjoy the forum. There are some great benefits. Members only will get travel opportunities and meal-shop discounts. Today, just a few of the benefits of being a member of the Historical Society. Membership forms are available right up here at the front. So tonight, we begin our 2016 series with Fall River Historical Society Director and Circus Historian Bob Kitchen, who is going to share the results of his research on Fall River's Rose Wentworth, who was described as, quote, lonely lady writer turned sunshine. It's an interesting story.
Well, thank you. Before I start, I just wanted to, last year a lady stopped me and said, you know, I really like those lectures. She said, but there's only one this year. And the implication was that when you say you have a lecture series, the word series implies more than one. So we do have 3 this year, luckily because of a couple of things. I'd also like to just mention how I came to do an article on this. I belong to the Circus Historical Society. 2 of my interests, Fall River history, circus history, and they put out a journal, looks like this. And it's a quarterly journal, and different people write articles for it on either circuses or circus personalities or circus events. And the journal came, and I sat down, I picked it up, and it said, there was an article, Rose Wentworth, a circus legend. And the first paragraph says, born in Fall River, Massachusetts. Now, as a Fall River historian and circus historian, that kind of struck me as being something I'd like to look into a little bit more. At about the same time, the assistant editor of the magazine contacted me, and he said, will you write an article for us? And I said, gee, I don't really have a topic. I said, he said, well, you know, it's been a while since you wrote an article. And I said, how long? He said, 12 years. So I said, okay, I guess you would call me a non-prolific writer. So I said, still don't have a topic. And I said, this Rose Wentworth interests me. And he said, don't let that stop you, that the article's just been written, because it was written a long time ago and just published now But there's a lot of information out there now that was not accessible, and I found that to be true. And I think of my college days and how hard it was to write term papers and things. You know, you just go online now, you pump in a word or somebody's name, and up pumps 50, 60 references or more. And you have to start separating them out then. But it's just so much easier than it used to be. But in any case, let me tell you something about Rose Wentworth. She lived here only a relatively short period of time. Rose was born in 1874. Her father's name was Charles Allington. This is a picture of Rose taken at probably about the height of her career, early 1900s. Charles Allington came to Fall River. I simply don't know when, because can't find any records on him. But that's true of a lot of people. The records was just simply, people just didn't register. Most people were born, again, Rose, for instance, we have a hard time finding her birth certificate because there were midwives, and the midwives simply didn't record everything, and everything's in longhand, and everything is non-chronological, so it's very difficult to find anything. But Rose, in every interview she gave, and she gave interviews from 1895, when she was 21, until she was 70 years old. And in every one of them, pretty much every one, she says, starts off, I was born in Fall River, Massachusetts. And she lived here for 5 years. Now, Charles Allington had 2 children, both born in Massachusetts, and his wife, and her last name was Cole, and she was born in Massachusetts as well. Now, I can't find any Allingtons, but I can find some Coles in the city directory, and they may or may not have been related to her. Just a little more research. But in any case, Charles Allington took his family back to England when Rose was 5. And when Rose was 8, Rose says, my father put me into dance classes, into ballet classes. And I think Charles Allington had an idea that maybe he could get Rose into the theater. Because Rose, in one interview, said, I came from a theater family. And so we end up well, okay. And so what happens is that Rose goes back to England, okay. And this, by the way, Rose was in this. This is about a 1900 photo of the Alice in Wonderland. Alice in Wonderland was written right at the end of the American Civil War. And there were 2 revivals, one in 1886 and one in 1888. And Rose was in the ballet corps of one of those 2 shows. Needless to say, it wasn't a very big part. She was also in a show with this lady here. This lady is a rather interesting lady. Mary Cora Urquhart, whose father was a Louisiana colonel and came with lots of money. And she married Mr. James Brown Potter, who had even more money. And she was a socialite. They had a home in New York. They summered in Newport. And she fancied herself an actress. And the reviews of the day said she was a competent actress, but she was nothing special. But she wanted to act, and she left her husband and family, went over to England, and her husband ended up divorcing her. Then he tried to prevent her from using his last name, or his name completely, and that did not work. Rose was in a play with her at the Gaiety Theater. And Rose tells a story when she's an elderly woman of a friend, I should say, the Prince of Wales, Prince Edward, is getting a special private preview of the show that's coming up. It's a rehearsal. And our friend here, Cora, was one of his cohorts. They traveled around. He had a reputation as being a womanizer and a man about town. And so he was getting a very special very special introduction to the play. What happens actually after that is kind of interesting, because Rose says, I'm standing there in my costume, my page costume, And he comes up behind me and he pulls her hair and she starts to cry. And then he asks her why she's crying. She said, because it hurt. And then he says, well, eventually she manages to get an apology out of none other than the Prince of Wales. And that seemed to indicate what Rose was going to be like from that point on. She was rather a feisty young lady. I think that what happened in this particular case was they finally decided that Rose wasn't suited for the theater. She was going nowhere. But serendipity occurred. And in 1889, James Bailey and P.T. Barnum decided to take their show to London and run it from the middle of November to the middle of February. And the feature of the show that year was a spectacle that was called Nero and the Burning of Rome. And this show had, the fellow who you see who was the producer here is a man named Imre Kiralfy. Kiralfy produced the show over on Staten Island in 1887, built a big pavilion and put on the show with a cast of hundreds. P.T. Barnum saw the show, liked it so much, he said to Kiralfy, can you do a cut-down version for me so I can put it in my circus tent? And Kiralfy said, well, we'll give it a try. So they moved the whole show over to London, and they start rehearsals. Now, they had plenty of help, plenty of performers that would play the parts of the there were gladiators, there were slaves, there were Christians being thrown to the lions in this thing. It was a rather involved production. And then even the working men on the show, you know, one minute they would be shoveling horse manure, and the next minute they were running around in a toga as part of the actors in the show. What the show lacked was women. And so James Bailey put out a call. He wanted to hire 90 women. They had to be between the ages of 16 and 21. He would accept young ladies 15 if their parents gave permission. That was Rose. She was 15 at the time, so her parents obviously gave permission. James Bailey hired her as a ballet girl. He also hired her to be part of a sideshow production, which was a series of illusions. It was called the Black Tent Show. Essentially, it was black canvas to block out the light, and it was a series of illusions, as you can see here. You know, just a head or a torso and a head sitting on a table. All of these were illusions. And Rose was, he asked her, how would you like to be in the Black Tent Show? She said, sure. And she is the lady you see, Venus rising, the lady coming up out of the sea. Venus rising up out of the sea in the red suit over on the right-hand side. You can see it on the right-hand side going up. So she became part of the sideshow as well. And then just to top it off, he said, how would you like to learn how to drive chariots? At the end of circus performances in those days, the blow-off, the end thing on the performance was racing chariots and racing horses. She said, sure. And so he ended up, she said later on, she said, you know, I ended up, I nearly had my arms pulled out of my body, you know, learning how to do that. She said, but she seemed to never said no. She was willing to do anything. The end result was she was kind of pretty much a favorite of James Bailey. And he introduces her to a fellow named Harry Wentworth, who's a clown. Harry is 19 years her senior. And he introduced, again, oh, this is another view of the, this is a different act, but again, just a poster of the day. He pairs her up with a guy named Harry Wentworth. Harry was a clown. He was a contortionist, you know, a bender, as they called him. He was, he also had a trained pig act. And so Harry, he says, he will be your protector on the circus lot. So she says, okay. And so Harry became her protector, and then later on, her husband. And again, Harry with the pig, and then I think the next slide may be Harry in his costume. Okay? Clowns looked a little bit different in those days. Let me tell you right now, on the circus, there was a definite caste system. Now, the circus originally was built upon the horse, the reason for the ring. If you went to a circus in the 1800s, there were a lot of horse acts. You go today, maybe one if you're lucky. Equestrians were at the top of the caste system. A contortionist down here. Where do you think the clowns were? At the bottom. Okay, so they were at the bottom. There was a definite caste system that went on in the circus. So again, Rose performs over in London and then comes back with the show to New York. She stays on the show for the 1890 season. Then James Bailey says to she, and I think he says to our friend Harry, he says, Harry, I'm going to put you on one of my other shows, okay? The Four Paw Cell Show. And what I want you to do is train Rose in every circus act that there is. And so they went over there and they stayed for 3 years. And Rose learned how to be a contortionist. And she said all of these things are really difficult to do. And she said, but now I can do just about anything. And she was very proud of the fact that she could. He taught her trapeze. And there's also an indication that he began to teach her how to ride a horse. Because she does come back in 1894, and she's listed as being a contortionist, a trap act, what they call a carrying act, where she would perform with a male rider. The male rider would do all of the work, and she would just pose, get up on his back and pose and that sort of thing. And then she was also still in the races, so Rose was doing everything. She comes back in 1894. In 1895, when she comes back to the Bailey Show, for the first time, we see her at least recognized as being a lady rider. That was her ultimate goal. What's rather interesting is, somewhere in here now, she gets married. Now, it's hard to tell because as an older woman, Rose said she was 14 when she got married. She told Harry she was 16 because she felt he wouldn't marry her. That wasn't the truth. Rose was not good at counting, I found, and she would make some statements that would be off. She might have been 16, so she might have been married at 16 or 17, probably over on the Four Paw Cell Show. But she still uses her maiden name, and finally figured out why, because she wanted to be an equestrian. The other acts she used her maiden name for. So when you go in the program, it says Maud Allington, and it lists all these other acts. When she's a writer, it says Rose Wentworth, it says equestrian. And so it was the caste system working, if you like. But she still did all of the other acts as well. In 1896, Rose ends up coming back, and for the first time, she's listed in the program as being one of the 3 lady writers, but she's listed 3rd. 3rd's not good enough for Rose, okay? She's going to do better than that. And again, this picture of Rose, probably, I'm going to guess, probably around 1896 or something like that, 95. Even though it says 1903, but that's when they put it in the program, okay? So she looks fairly young here. So in any case, Rose ends up on the list as 3rd on the 3rd lady writer. Now, all of these acts went into vaudeville in the wintertime to make some money. You got to keep eating. So what Rose ended up doing in this particular case was that she instead goes back to winter quarters, which was in Bridgeport, Connecticut in those days, to the Barnum and Bailey Show, and she's going to learn a trick that's going to put her not 3rd but 1st. And it's going to be a somersault on the back of a horse. Now, how do you teach someone to do that without killing themselves? They use something called a mechanic. A mechanic was simply, the simplest kind, if you can imagine a pulley hung from the middle of a ceiling, there's the horse ring here, and one guy holds this end of the rope, the other end of the rope goes through the pulley down to a harness. The equestrian puts the harness on, the horse canters around the ring, and of course, you get that bouncing effect. As the horse comes up, then the equestrian tries the trick. If they miss, the guy pulls on the rope and you don't fall on the ground and kill yourself. And so she would do 70 of these every single day. By the time the show opens in April, she's catching the trick almost constantly. And finally, Rose becomes the premier writer on the Barnum and Bailey show. Again, the costume she has on over here is a jockey costume. Again, this is she would use this when she was in the races at the end of the show. We found out we don't like this picture. It doesn't look like Rose, okay?
Looks like a man.
Looks like a man, yeah. And this is interesting because here she's called Mrs. Maud Wentworth. Now, she used all of these different names, okay? She's Maud Wentworth, Rose Wentworth, Maud Allington, Rose Allington, which is why we ended up with the title, Rose by Any Other Name. Eventually it comes back to that, you see. I said to the lady who edited the magazine, I said, how do you like this? And she said, I like that a lot. I said, you don't think it's too cutesy, do you? And she said, no, I think I kind of like that, she said. By the way, the previous fellow who wrote the article thought that this probably was his sister. And it's not. It was his wife at the time. She just was using whatever name she could in any case. And of course, the horses they used were Rosenbachs. They were big work horses that had big wide backs on them, so that, remember, you're going to be riding around, that's a bareback act, which was quite difficult. Later on, when Rose got older, what became popular, what they called pad acts. They put a pad on the back of the horse, and that was a little bit easier to do, but that wasn't for Rose. Now this is interesting here. If you look at this. This is the 1896. She's not the first writer yet. She's not going to do that till it's 1897. And you'll notice that it says here that she's re-engaged for 1897. And that's the year she threw the somersault on the horse. So they had planned this very well. This was put in the program the year before, at the end of the circus season, and they put this in. Of course, Rose ends up being the premier writer of the time, and she was. You notice Harry's mentioned here with his trained pigs, and there seemed to be a pretty good relationship, by the way, even though they were separated by 19 years.
And how many pigs?
And here's the poster for Rose, okay? There she is, the only lady throwing somersaults. Now, she probably was only the second or third lady to throw a somersault on the back of a horse. What's kind of interesting is because in 1894, by the way, she and Harry bought a house in Pennsylvania because her father came over back to America in 1893, and they bought a 17-room house just in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And so she obviously was making enough money to be able to do that at the time. Both she and Harry were, again, really at the top of the game. Now, what happened was in 1888, by the way, P.T. Barnum died in, excuse me, in 1888? 1888. Back here. In 1898, they decided to take the Barnum and Bailey show back not only to England, but to Europe. The whole show, pick it up, tents, elephants, horses, performers, everything. They go across the ocean. They set up winter quarters in Stoke-on-Trent in England, and they stay 2 years in England. And they do the British Isles. They do Scotland, they do England, they do Wales, and I don't think they went to Ireland at that particular time. Then they moved the winter quarters over to Vienna, and in Vienna they ended up doing Germany and Austria. Then they moved it back over to Paris, and they stayed 2 years in Paris, and they did Hungary, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and a few other countries. So they stayed quite a while. So they stayed until until 1902. Now, in 1903, I should say that Rose and Harry did not come back with the show. They got an offer from Swiss National Circus, which was really the top of the line show. Oh, these photographs, by the way, I just put these in. These were souvenir photographs, obviously from Germany, the German officers with their monocles. So this would be around 1901 or so, okay? And of course, they're all in love with the lady on the back of the horse. What I like about these, I've been picking these things up. I don't know what they say because I can't read French, but it's someone have them interpret them for me sometime. And again, this is the jockey act that you see. This is the type of act that Rose would do. I told you they liked horses. This is a Liberty Horse act. There are 70 horses there. 70. And all performing in some order. And this is an interesting photograph as well. Everyone in this photograph is a woman. The circus is way ahead of its time as far as giving women the opportunity. And I found a lot of references to the fact, for instance, there was one article that said women can do anything that men can do, and it was written by a man, except cook. Whatever that means. But he said, you know, the greatest rider in the world can throw a somersault on the back of a horse, so can Rose Wentworth. And he just said, what's the difference? But in any case, the clowns and the ringmasters are all women. Now, they use this act in the United States. And again, as I said, they were all women, including the clowns. And this one was originally done in the late 1890s, okay? And again, it's being done over here in Europe right up to 1902. This is the show I was mentioning that Rose and Harry went to. It's a Swiss National Circus. And not many Americans had the opportunity to be asked to go there. And this also was missed completely in previous recordings of Rose's career. And there are lots of pictures. Remember, Rose was a dancer. Now, obviously, in the European shows, they used dancers in this case. And you see Rose here in costume dancing. So that was probably one of the things that she did on the show. The costume that she's wearing here at the upper right, it looks like maybe something she would use in a contortion act. So she's also doing contortion here. And here, she's dancing again. And this, by the way, is the cakewalk, which Europeans were dying to see. The cakewalk was a black dance that was done with big high steps where they kicked their heels up way up over their heads. And of course, Rose was a dancer. She was flexible and she could do all of these things. And the picture I like, this is another picture that came from Europe, and there's Rose on the back of the horse doing her specialty. Again, she's the premier rider of the world at this particular point, 1903. Rose and Harry come back to America, by the way. And by the way, this is also a European picture. So this is about probably taken about 1903 as well, of Rose. Now, when they get back to the States at the end of the season in 1903, they put an ad in. There was a trade paper called the New York Clipper. It was for people who were in the theater, circus, carnivals, rodeos, Wild West shows, anybody that was on the road. Essentially, it was a place where you could advertise. You could find a job, okay, and or you could actually go looking for a job, in this particular case, advertising. Now, they already have a job. They're coming back in 1904. Rose and Harry have a job, but they put this in anyway. And you'll notice there's also tells you that it tells you that they had been over there and they're back. We're back, okay? We're coming back. But again, there's nothing wrong with advertising for the future. Circus contracts generally ran 1 year. Now, this is an interesting picture that came later on. In 1904, when Rose gets back to the circus, by the way, the circus was always conscious of the fact that there were people who saw circus women as being loose, immoral, and every once in a while they would go on a campaign. And for some strange reason, in 1904, they go on to this particular campaign is going to what they call the gowning experiment. Now, there's a whole, they would put all of this publicity out, and the ladies on the show were going to, you know, how they were moral, they were all of these different things, and they were going to perform these long dresses. Well, I can't imagine anybody performing in a long dress doing backflips on a horse. There's one poster that's out there of a flying return act, you know, a trapeze act, and the gals are in long dresses. How do you catch them? How does the catcher grab them when they get to the other side, okay? The historian Janet Davis at the University of Texas says she thinks the whole thing was fiction. It was just publicity that they put out. And then finally, in 1906, they finally said, no, our women, they're all out there strong, they're healthy, you know, and this is the way they dress to do their particular acts. But what's kind of interesting is, in the advertising, it said, talked about the gowning experiment, and Rose Wentworth was one of the leaders of this gowning experiment. Well, guess where Rose is? Right in the front with the big hat and the fancy dress. Now, in the circus dining room, which is a tent, the performers had to dress for dinner every night. And this is the 4th of July, 1904, and there's Rose right in the front. And the guy next to her is Harry. The first picture I think I've seen of Harry Wentworth. I always thought he had a little pointed hat and things, but he didn't. He actually was a real person underneath all of this. And as you can see, all the flags that are on the table. Another thing that they came back with, they advertised the fact that they had a new act. They weren't going on the road at the end of the 1903 season. They were working on a new act, and it was an English carriage act. Now, Harry was the guy, he played the part of a sort of a groom, and then there was a gentleman equestrian also on here. And then they would do various tricks on the horse, and Rose would finish by throwing a somersault from the cart to the horse. I would think it would go from the horse to the cart, but she threw it from the cart to the horse. And again, always looking for something new. And no matter, as soon as there was a review in the paper, it was always, Rose always got the better part of it. When the three ladies performed on the opening of the Barnum and Bailey show way back in 1897, the reviewer said the ladies were all great, they got plenty of applause, but Rose Wentworth got more because she could throw that somersault on the back of a horse. So she was someone that just with a lot of persistence and guts, I guess, and tried to get ahead. Oh, we saw this one already. Okay, this is... What is kind of interesting, that was in 1904. And of course, she was on the Barnum show again in 1905. In 1906, James Bailey dies. And he was sort of her protector on the show. He took, if James Bailey was there, they had a job. But what happened was James Bailey dies, his widow inherits the show, she puts her brother in charge. He had traveled with the show, and Bailey just thought the guy was incompetent and didn't give him any things to do. Now suddenly he's in charge, and this was his opportunity to get back at all of those people that his brother-in-law liked. So I think that what happened was they simply went off at a contract. And that was back again in 1906. Now in 1907, again, they don't have a contract, and Rose and Harry end up down in Cuba at the Publón Circus. And I think they're down there because that's what the work that they could get. Now, Rose sends a series of very almost begging letters to Al Ringling, and she's looking for a job the next year. And she just says, no, I sent you a letter. I'll work for $125 a week, and Harry will clown for $65 a week. He doesn't answer her, so she writes back, I wrote you this letter, I got to make my plans. What do you think? These are all the things that I will do, and Harry will just do his standard clowning. So Al Ringling gave her $100 a week, which included the money for a groom, and Harry got $60 a week. So they worked on the Ringling show in 1908, and that was the only time they worked on the Ringling show. And this is where Rose's career and personal life begin to come apart. And in 1908, she and Harry are on the Ringling show, but I think they're not too happy. There's not a lot of references to them in the trade papers. And at the end of 1908, I think the marriage breaks apart somehow. Because in 1909, Rose is on the road by herself. And there's no sign of Harry. But what's rather interesting is that when Rose was an older woman, she made the following statement. She says, my first husband died in 1909, and I married my second husband in 1912. Well, if Harry was dead in 1909, somebody forgot to tell him, because he was still kicking in 1913. And strictly by accident, I was looking through the New York Clipper, and I hit all newspapers, and this little paper, the Urbana Courier, comes up in 1913, and it's one of these little fillers on the side, and it's the sad story of a clown who he's telling the police his sad story that his wife, who was an equestrian, his name is Harry Wentworth, his wife was an equestrian in the circus, and she abandoned him in Jenkinstown, Pennsylvania, and took their bank account. I have a feeling that Harry might have been picked up for vagrancy, perhaps. And he asked to go to the Bridewell. The Bridewell, I believe, was a home for indigent people. Now, Harry only shows up in 1909 in one reference, and it's the fact that he has a letter back at the Clipper, because these people were on the road, and as I said, that people would mail him letters. And I don't know whether Harry ever picked the letter up or not, but it could have been either his divorce papers or a Dear Harry letter that he missed. But in any case, their marriage was over. Now, what happens later on, Rose does a couple of independent dates and again gets great reviews. Again, worked really hard. She gets hired for a week. She said, hire me back for another week and I'll do a completely different show. And she does. And she gets written up in the newspaper. She ends up on a carnival and doing probably a free show. And what's rather interesting here is the fact that you'll see in the advertisement, it says Rose Wentworth and her Arabian Stallions. On the same bill, Ed Carr and his rodeo and his buffalo cart. He had a cart that was pulled by 2 buffaloes. Well, again, she said she married Ed Carr in 1912, and unfortunately, when I Googled, I went on to genealogy.com, and you get all kinds of information. What pops up? But marriage records from 1909 in Jefferson, Kentucky. And there's Rose, as you can see. She signs Maud Rose Allington. She uses her maiden name. And Ed's name is on the other side of the page. So she marries Ed in 1909. So this is probably shortly after she had divorced, or whether they were married or not, I'm not even sure, okay, at this particular point. Maybe she did just abandon him because there was no marriage at all. But in any case, they finished the season on the carnival, and in 1910, they retire to his ranch, which is out in South Dakota on the Cheyenne River Indian Reservation, of all places. And I think what they're doing is they're getting ready here to go out on the road again. And in 1912, they had the Calgary Stampede, which you probably have heard about. It's just a big rodeo, and it was the first year that they were going to have it. And I think that they got wind of the rodeo, and they were training to go onto the rodeo, because one of her neighbors was a gentleman here This fellow here, Bob Yoakum is his name. I love the name. Buffalo Bob Yoakum. He was right out of the Old West. He ran a saloon. He was a gunslinging sheriff. And he's one of the few people who got a full-page write-up in the program for the Calgary Stampede. Now, he loved buffaloes, and it supposedly took him 5 years to train the buffaloes. They're not the brightest animals in the animal kingdom, you see. It took him 5 years. So the guy has a lot of patience as well. Now, when Rose met Ed Carr, her second husband, he had the buffaloes because he had bought a half interest in them. And so they're going to take them on the road again. But notice what they have. The cart is gone. And what you have here is a circus racing chariot. I have a catalog at home that's got the same thing right in the book. These things were designed to go very fast in circles. They had one wheel that was heavier than the other to make sure that it stayed in balance. And here are the buffaloes pulling the circus cart. That's Rose's influence on that, okay? She probably said, get rid of the cart, okay? Later on, these things end up being called Rose Wentworth's Buffaloes, and everybody kind of forgot about Bob Yoakum. Now, this photo here is Rose. Again, they also had bucking buffalo, and there's Rose in the back of a buffalo here, which supposedly she rode out on the ranch. What's kind of interesting, I have to tell you how I came by. Some of these photos came from the Calgary Stampede. But I Googled Rose Wentworth one time, and what pops up but a page that somebody's personal page with a lot of pictures of buffaloes on it. And then there's Rose Wentworth and Ed Carr and Bob Yoakum. So I sent the guy an email and I said, gee, you know, I mean, this is great. I love these pictures. I'd be willing to buy them for you, whatever you want to do. And the guy said, oh, no, he said, you know, he said, I love buffaloes, he says, and I'm just happy that somebody else does too. Well, I didn't tell him I'm not that fond of buffaloes, but I did get the use of those little the cards in any case. The card's in tough shape, but it's the only one I've ever seen, and it's part of his collection. I guess he just has all these postcards and pictures of buffaloes. And here's Rose and her second husband, Ed Carr. Now remember, our friend Harry Wentworth was 19 years her senior. Ed Carr is 6 years her junior. When the census came, she made him only 3 years her junior, okay? Which is rather interesting. She also had a little trouble with age for a period of time there in figuring things out. And you'll notice they're called Rose Wentworth's Buffaloes, okay? And she's part owner, I guess, because Ed's part owner. And then another view, Ed's the guy, I don't know whether he was an Indian. He lived on an Indian reservation, or if he had any Indian blood, but from what I gather, came from Indiana to start off with. That's the closest thing, perhaps. I was going to say, you know, yes, in this particular case, bad joke, I was going to say she traded Harry in for a new car. But, yeah, I know, it's just to keep you awake, folks. Again, and here is Ed, who was certainly a lot more athletic than Harry was, I think, okay?
He's no clown.
And then this was during the parade at the Calgary Stampede. Now, the Calgary Stampede lasted a week. When they were done, I mean, they practiced forever to go there. What they did was they put together a sort of a rodeo, and they took it on the road, and they played a few dates in Western Canada. By the way, the Calgary Stampede, in any case, lasted just 1912. And because of there was a depression and World War I was brewing, they decided to postpone it. But it's held every year now, and it is a very, very big event. But that was the end. So that took them through 1912. In 1913, this is probably the last time Rose goes on the road. And she and the Buffalo get hired by the Buffalo Bill, Pawnee Bill Wild West show. Now, everybody knows who Buffalo Bill was. Buffalo Bill was the great buffalo hunter, the Indian fighter. He was also an alcoholic and a bad businessman. But he had a good businessman who ran the business with him. And when that man died, his show went kind of down the drain. I mean, he took his show to Europe. They made lots of money. Then he lost lots of money. And they ended up, frankly, with nothing. So somebody got the idea. He had the name recognition, just like Rose Wentworth had the name recognition. So we'll get Buffalo Bill. We'll team him up with Pawnee Bill, who was one of his competitors at one time, and we'll put out the show, which in the business they called it the Two Bill Show. Bill Cody, Pawnee Bill, okay? The Two Bill Show. And again, Rose rates a poster. The show goes out. It lasts to the middle of August, and it folds. So they're out of work again. They finish again on a carnival, and then they kind of disappear for a couple of years. They go out to the ranch, and my guess is Rose did say at one point that we went out there and I rode buffaloes and horses, and Ed bought me a car, and all of these various things that was happening. But then there's this newspaper article, as you can see, of Rose over here. That's when she told the story of the king pulling her hair. Now, what happened was, this is a 1937 article. What attracted the reporter to Rose was the fact that she was running a kennel out of her 17-room house. And at the time, she had 70 dogs, 17 cats, and a 42-year-old deaf parrot, the reporter says. And she said that her friends talked her into doing this. Evidently, back in at that time, there weren't that many kennels around. And Rose tells the story, of course, about the king and several other things, mentioned she's from Fall River. And she was interviewed, as I said, right through her life, right out until about, her last interview was in 1945. As she got older, though, she began to suffer from probably what we would call dementia, and maybe even Alzheimer's. She began to see things like, images in fry pans and that sort of thing. And so Rose ended up, the last mention of Rose is 1949. And right after that, she went into the Norris, to the mental hospital just outside of Norristown, Pennsylvania. There was a mental hospital there. That's where she ended up her life. She lived to be 84. And she had quite a life, actually. She was, some of the, just the little newspaper things that they had. For instance, one newspaper called her, mentioned she, and May Worth was a great circus writer. And she and May Worth were probably the two best writers, according to this particular person who wrote this particular article. And then in 1912, there was an article, and I just picked it up, and it said, Rose Wentworth, the woman who does somersaults on horseback in the Barnum Show, was an actress, a chorus girl, who saw nothing ahead for a girl like herself on the modern stage. And when she announced to her companions that she was going to be a lady writer, they laughed at her. This was but a few years ago. She is at the head of her profession in her specialties on bareback. She was determined to accomplish what no other woman can do, however, and she received every encouragement from Mr. Bailey. And that is exactly true. That sums up the whole story, pretty much, of Rose Wentworth. And on perhaps her very last interview, she says, the article was entitled, Retired Circus Queen, 79, knows she can ride 'em. And she says, in the article, Rose said, I know that I could no longer throw a somersault on the back of a horse, but I know that I would not be bucked off. And you know what? If I had to pick between a bucking bronco and Rose Wentworth, even at 70, I think I would pick Rose Wentworth. So that is the story of our friend Rose Maud Allington Wentworth Carr and various variations of that name. She was certainly a Rose by any other name. Thank you very much. I don't know if anyone has any questions, but...
Bob, what did you mean by the term black dance?
A what?
Black.
Oh, a
dance.
black. It was a Negro dance, okay? Okay. But, and as a matter of fact, that picture you saw, we cut off the rather, it was not addressed that way in 1903, okay? So we just made it for today, okay? We just dressed it up a little bit. Okay, but in any case, yeah, she did do the cakewalk. And again, as I said, she had lots of training in dance. What's kind of interesting is when you get involved in something like the thing, I found a lot of new information, actually kind of fun. But you do with all of what's online now, genealogy.com, newspapers.com, there's just so much more out there. And I think back how hard I worked when I was in college, and it's a lot easier now. Those kids don't know, right, Phil? They don't know what it's like to do a paper, so. Any other question? Yes?
When she performed in Wild Bill's show,
Pardon?
when she performed in Buffalo Bill's show, did she perform alongside Annie Oakley?
Yes, that show, the Wild West shows were done in the open because they used guns. Okay, there would be some shooting involved, and of course, if you had a tent, you'd shoot it full of holes. So what they did was they sidewalled. If you can imagine a tent with no top, they sidewalled, and they had an entrance over here. And of course, the Wild West shows are very popular in the late 19th, early 20th century. The Wild West, lasted a very short period of time, and Buffalo Bill brought the Wild West to the east. He came to Fall River even, and it was your chance to see real Indians, okay? You could see real Indians, and there was cavalry, and somehow we even got cavalry units from Britain and Germany and other places to be on the show. And so it was quite a show. The thing is, once you saw the show a couple of times, it got to be pretty much the same, but they would be riding bucking horses and that sort of thing. And there's some interesting film done of the Buffalo Bill show way back in 1902, which is on paper positive film, which shows some of the acts. It looks like a snowstorm, but at the same time, you can actually see what's going on. So she would perform in the open, of course, and she would perform with her team of buffaloes.
But Annie Oakley, was Annie Oakley included in those shows that she was in?
No, Annie Oakley was before. Yeah, well before. Annie Oakley was on the Buffalo Bill show when it was really doing well. Buffalo Bill, by the way, this was 1913. 1914 is when he died. And he ended up as just being like an attraction on a show in 1914. They just announced them. Circuses did that also. Boxers. Joe Louis went on a circus one time. You remember Hopalong Cassidy was there. Different personalities were there that were generally to attract kids. Joe Louis, of course, would attract, he had been the world champion at one time. It was sort of at the end of his career.
Did Rose have any other family?
No. So essentially Rose had, her mother died, and died in 1923. What's kind of interesting is Rose ends up in 1922, she's living in Roswell, New Mexico. And what happened, yeah, okay. She's in Roswell, New Mexico. By the way, that's where Ed Carr is buried with his second wife. What's rather interesting, I go online, and there's a picture of his grave, of all things. There were people who go out and take pictures of graves and things and put them on Facebook. And that was kind of an interesting, so there he is with his second wife. But when her mother died in 1923, she came back to take care of her father. Her brother eventually died. They all died, so it was Rose all alone in that 17-room house. Of course, then later on, she had lots of animals around. And then then began to pretty much, she died of, I think the death certificate said psychosis and essentially hardening of the arteries of the brain, I think is what they call it back in those days. And so she was pretty much, had forgotten just about everything. But she certainly had a pretty neat career, I think. And what do you expect from somebody from Fall River, right? Any other questions?
Bob, did she ever come to Fall River?
You know what I did was, I thought was interesting. She did come back to Fall River with the Bonham Show, 2 years, I think. And I did go through the newspapers to see if it was mentioned at all. But I found the newspapers didn't carry too much about the show. that sort of thing. But it seems to me it would be good advertising to say, hey, there's a Fall River, there's somebody that was born in Fall River. But she did come back, I think, 2 or 3 times. Circus roots are easy to find. They're well kept. The circus kept terrific records, and what they did was they had what they called a root book. Every performer was listed, told you what they did, and every day they kept a journal. What was the weather like? Were there any accidents? You know, once in a while you see somebody died, or somebody had a baby born or something. Everything was kept on a daily basis. So the records are very good. And again, it's easy to follow somebody, and with the trade papers and something like those that are online, it's very easy to follow someone now. It's just, I was just amazed at how easy it was compared to the struggle that I did back when, you know, you went and get books in print and periodicals and all of those things, and I try to get them. Now they're all right there for you. So it's one of the good things about computers.
Bob, is there any film footage, maybe at a later time, that gives us a sense of the...
No, haven't found any, no. And I've looked around, and I've gone to the museums, and if anybody had them, the museums would. The Ringling Museum in Sarasota and the Circus World Museum in Baraboo have got extensive libraries, but they don't have any. And the University of Illinois has got, at Normal, it's got pretty good records too. Well, if there are no other questions, I thank you for coming. It's been my pleasure.